All right, guys. I think we're gonna get started. Hello, I'm Kevin.
My name is Keshvi.
And then also we have some lovely TAs who are part of the content too. So raise your hands. There you go. So if you guys have any questions during the workshop, they'll be here to help you. And yeah, take it away.
Alrighty. So just a brief overview of what we're going to be going over today. First, we're going to review what exactly React is. Then we're going to introduce you guys to React components and talk about how they play a role in making web applications with React. Then we're going to move on to props versus state and talk about the big differences between the two and how they relate to React components. After that, we'll talk a bit about why React is so widely used and why you should want to use it. And we will end the presentation with a live code demo where you guys will be creating a web application that functions as a to-do list. All right, so what is React? React is a JavaScript-based UI development library. It was developed by Facebook and it's widely used by developers today to create dynamic web applications. Okay, so when you look at any web application today, it's typically composed of more than one element, and these elements, right, it's typically composed of many smaller elements that vary in terms of appearance, function, and level of interactivity. So in this picture on the right, as you can see the web page created by React, and you can see on the left are all of its components. These are the elements that compose the React web page. So you could say that components are the building blocks of any React application. They're reusable bits of code that accept inputs or props, which we'll get into later, and return an HTML element that describes how a section of the UI should appear to users. They serve a similar purpose to JavaScript functions, which we will also talk about later, and they are also responsive to changes in data. All right, now we're going to talk about a bit about props versus state. So props are the inputs that are passed into a React component. They're very similar to arguments that are passed into any JavaScript function. What props do is they serve as input. They should not be changed, and they contain information that is usually set by either a default or by a parent component. State, on the other hand, is the current state of the component, and it is usually created inside the component. State is changeable. It is also responsible for triggering the renderings of the component, which we'll explain in better detail later. But yeah, basically changes to state are what trigger a component to be re-rendered. And the state keeps track of private information that is initialized, changed, and used by the component between renderings. So just to visualize this a bit, we have here a React component, and as you can see, the props are the input that we pass into the component, and the state here is constantly being updated based on changes in data for that component. To use an analogy, let's say we have a glass of water, and that is our component. And let's say one property that we want to pass into this glass of water is the volume, which is 50 milliliters. And we want to pass in 50 milliliters. Here we have the state of the water, which is determined by internal data, such as its temperature. So water at 25 degrees Celsius is going to be in the liquid state. If we were to change the temperature of the water, then the state would update and it would become solid if it were 0 degrees Celsius. So this is just a small analogy for how states work, components, and how props work as well.
Yeah, it's why it's called React. It's like reacting to different things that happen, like different events that are fired on a website, and then kind of updating components based on that.
Yes, so even just a change to one piece of data inside this component will trigger the component to be re-rendered or the state to be updated. So the value of the temperature will, like any changes to that value will cause the state to change. And React components work the same way. Yeah, and then here we also have the state in its gaseous form when the temperature is 100 degrees Celsius. And this is just a component tree, just to show you guys how parent components can pass props or inputs into their children components. So you can see that this component is setting the values or the props for its children. All right, so why do developers use React today? React has many benefits, one of them being that it's very easy to use to create dynamic application. React is so easy to use because it's a lot more simple and and requires less coding than JavaScript. JavaScript can also often get very complex very easily when you're trying to create very dynamic web applications. So a lot of developers prefer to use React instead. React also uses something called a virtual DOM, which helps it to create web applications faster. So this means that it has improved performance. The way virtual DOM basically works is that instead of updating all the components on a web page all at once, it only looks for the components whose states have been changed, and then it only updates those components. So this results in a better performance for the web page as a whole. It also has reusable components. So we talked about how components are reusable bits of code, and this just generally simplifies the development process for the web page a lot and makes it a lot quicker. And there are also dedicated tools for easy debugging of React web pages. For example, Facebook has released a Chrome extension that can be used to debug these applications, and it's very easy. And honestly, I think the biggest reason that React is such a popular tool is it has a huge support community. It's very popular right now, and it also looks really great on resumes for jobs. So good job for you guys for coming to this workshop. All right, and here are a few popular applications that use React. We have Facebook, Instagram, Netflix, Dropbox, among many others. All right, so I'm now going to hand it over to Richard, and he's going to start on our live code demo.
All right, so the first part of this live code demo is basically just going to be a review of some of the things that we covered from last time. So at the end of last time's workshop, everybody should have cloned the Vandy Hacks workshop repository into their GitHub. You can access that by just going to your GitHub account. And I believe everybody should be part of the Vandy Hacks organization. Or is it the VH workshop?
Or just
Mentorship,
go to
this one.
vhl.inc/takehomes. And it should be the first one there. But if you've done everything, you should already have forked this.
Yeah.
Has anyone not done that? Okay.
What's the link?
vhl.inc/takehomes.
Okay, yeah, there you go. That takes you to here. Basically go to workshop. Oops. Workshop.
Then go to fork.
And then fork it so that you can fork it to your personal GitHub. After you fork it, let's go like here. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. After you fork it, you have your own repository. Some of you probably have already done this, so don't worry about it. but you're going to want to kind of copy the link to it. And then you're going to want to go into your command line or terminal. I use Hyper, but like you can use terminal or whatever you use for Windows. And then try to get into the directory that you might want to be using. So like here, if I show all these folders, there's a lot of them, but I want to get into my desktop folder, right? So I would change directory CD into our desktop, and then I would type in git clone, and then I would paste the link. And then I would hit that and it would clone it and it would be on my desktop, so workshop. However, if you already have that workshop, if you already have that workshop folder on your computer, you don't need to worry about this step. Yeah, this is just for people who were not at our previous workshop, but just to get everyone up to speed, right? And then you want to change directory or CD into the workshop folder. Wait.
Yeah.
How do we create React app? No, but like now we have, okay, cool. So change your directory into your workshop, because now that's a workshop folder. So it's going to be a cute little directory, and hopefully you've pulled it, your README MD from GitHub. So that's this file right here. Are we all there? All right, and then what you want to do is you want to actually initialize our React app. And in order to do that, you have to type in npx space create -react -app, and then the name of the application. So here we're just going to call it Todolist or something, singular word, no spaces. So I'm going to hit enter on that, and then we're going to wait, and it's going to take a while, but eventually we'll have our own little application. Any questions? Good.
Just the command in case it's a little small for everyone.
All right, and it's going to take a while. Yeah, a lot of packages, dependencies to download. The thing about React, right? It's a huge library with a bunch of features for you to kind of use JavaScript in a way that you can kind of manipulate the DOM a lot easier. So it's a lot of code and a lot of things that need to be configured, which is why it takes so long. So,
but after you're done configuring, all you need to do is type these two commands that are at the bottom right there. First, you cd into your directory. You cd into the React directory just by typing cd Todolist. And then you simply just type npm start. And this should open a new tab in your web browser that shows the default React app that React creates for you. And this was something that we covered last time. So in case any of you guys did not do that, please feel free to do that now. Okay. Yeah. The next step is to open Visual Studio Code. And specifically, we want to go to the project that we just created. So you're going to go File, Open, and Kevin, can you? I think it's in your desktop,
yeah, just
right?
in my desktop. But also, if it's like in your desktop, right? So you can click on Workshop, click Todolist, and then click Open, and it'll open it. Or like literally, if it's in your desktop, just like drag this in, and voila. Yeah.
And you'll have what we just created opened onto Visual Studio Code. We're going to give everyone a few seconds to just get to this step. Okay. Once you have the basic template opened onto your Visual Studio Code, I want you guys all to go to source, the source folder right here on the left, and go down to index.js. Oh yeah, this a little larger. All right. Can everybody see this? Is it too small for anyone? Okay. So this index.js file has a couple of important code snippets that we want to talk about. So the first are the first two lines. These first two lines are probably the most important two lines that you will use. And that's because these actually import the React library into your code. Without these two lines, you won't be able to use React. So what we see here is we import React from React. Basically, we're importing the library of React into our code. And next, we're importing React DOM. And what React DOM basically does is it modifies something called the DOM, which is, I think it stands for the document object model. And it basically allows you to inject, React code into your HTML. All right. These few lines of code right here from line 7 to 12 are what allows React to render your application to your screen. And specifically, the command that's used here is React DOM, which is this, .render. And render allows you to render HTML code to your website. Now, what's really cool about React is that it allows you to use HTML code inside of your JavaScript code. As you can see, these few lines of code with uniquely, the less than equal sign, the greater than sign, and like these tags right here that we talked about last time, these tags are all HTML code. And React allows us to inject HTML code into a JavaScript file. And that's what makes it really unique. This is your first parameter in the render function. The render function's first parameter is going to be some HTML. And the second parameter in the render function is document.getElementById root. What does this mean? Well, if we go to our public folder and we go to index.html, you'll notice that there's a div, and the div has the ID of root, and the div is specifically located in the body. What our old code index.js basically did is it told index.html to find the div with the ID root. And what it's going to do is it's going to inject all of this HTML code inside of this div root.
It looks way more complicated.
It looks way more complicated than it is. Yeah.
If you go back to index.html, like it's just a bunch of comments.
It's just a bunch of comments.
Like meta stuff.
Yeah. But in this React workshop, we won't actually be touching this index.html file. So we're just going to close that out.
And you will never.
Yeah, you will probably never need to. In fact, you're probably never going to even need to touch the index.js file. We're just explaining to you in general what it does. All right. Now, you might be wondering what this line of code does. The app tag. This is what Keshvi talked about earlier. This is what's known as a component. A component in React is simply just a bit of code that can be reused, and it can be simplified into an HTML tag. We're able to access this component off of this line of code right here, where we say import app from /app. This name app here is actually a name of a function. And this app here is the name of its directory. We're going to talk a little bit about how you import components right now, actually, because I think it's going to be important for later. So this actually gets into a little bit of specifics into how the document organization or file organization works in React. If you want to access a file that's the part of your same directory meaning a folder, such as this Todolist folder, we use /. And then the name of the file itself, app. That's basically going to access this app.js file, because this app.js file is at the same document hierarchy as this index.js file. If we wanted to access a file that's in another folder, but that folder is in our same directory, we can do, for example, // the folder name / the file name inside of the folder. And if we wanted to access something that's in a directory above us, we use 2 dots instead, slash folder that the folder can be above our current directory. All right. So basically, this ./app here is telling us that we want to access this app file that's within the same directory as our index.js file. And this index.js file is in this source directory right here, right? And this app.js file is also within the source directory. So we're going to be accessing the app.js file. Now this app.js file is really where all the magic occurs, because this is our app component. Every component is going to have a function by the name of the component. So in this case, function app. And this component function is going to return something. Namely, it's going to return some HTML code. Remember how we mentioned earlier that React, one specific thing about React is that it allows us to inject HTML code inside of our JavaScript function. And finally, we're going to export default app. Export default app basically means that we can import app directly from a file that uses the app component. All right. So everything that we saw earlier here is actually just this bit of code right here. So let's actually just delete everything. I'll keep something. Let's just keep a blank div. If I save everything, you'll notice that everything is gone. All right. So now we can actually inject some HTML for ourselves, and we can write our first basic React app. So I'm actually going to demonstrate something that is not exactly good practice, but I'm going to basically have a paragraph here. And this paragraph is just going to say to-do list. Or I'll make it an H1 just to make it a little bit bigger. Remember, an H1, as we talked about last time, is just a big heading. So if I save here and we go back, we'll see that to-do list is in our big heading right there.
Is everyone there? Good. Cool.
Now I'm going to do something that's not considered good practice. I'm going to write another paragraph tag underneath this. And I'm just going to give this like a basic description. This is our to-do list. And you'll notice immediately that our compiler gives us red squiggly lines, which means that our compiler is not happy with us. The reason why our compiler is not happy with us is because we included 2 separate HTML elements, namely the H1 and the paragraph. And these 2 are separate. We cannot do this in React. Whenever we return some HTML, we always have to include just one HTML tag, one HTML container. And all of our HTML can be within that container, but we can only have one HTML container. In this case, we actually have 2 HTML containers. We have the H1 and the P. Now, there's a really simple fix to solve this, and that's just by encapsulating everything in a div.
It's like a function. You can only return like a number or like a string. You can't return 2 numbers or 2 strings. The function. It only
Exactly.
return one thing. Yeah.
Oops.
And also make sure that you're saving in order to see your changes.
Yeah. And now if we go back, we'll see that we have what we wanted, the to-do list and the brief description. This is our to-do list. So in summary, we basically encapsulated everything within a div. And because everything is encapsulated within this one HTML tag, React is happy. It allows us to return properly. All right. I'm going to actually just take out this paragraph tag right here. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we're actually going to be doing. All right. So far, we've used all of the default components that React gave us. But now let's try to be creative. Let's use our own custom component. And essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a list component. And this list component is going to contain tasks, where each task represents something in an element in our to-do list, such as a homework assignment or study for an exam, whatever. All of those are going to be encapsulated within our list. So now let's actually create our list component. So in order to create a list component, we're going to right click on the source folder and we're going to create a new folder. And this folder, we're just going to call the components folder. Everything that's in this components folder is going to be a component that we create. So now if I right click on this component folder and I click new file, I can create our component. And I'm just going to call our component list.js. So this creates a new list file that basically contains everything that we need for our list. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import React. And by importing React, I can inject HTML code within, or I can inject HTML code within my JavaScript. So I'm just going to say import React from React. Next, I'm going to create the function that represents our component. And that can be done by using the function keyword followed by the name of our component, which is just list. Empty parentheses and curly braces. I'm going to make sure that our component returns something. Namely, it's going to return our HTML code. And then finally, I'm going to export our function, or I'm going to export our component so that we can use it in other JS files, such as our app.js file. So I'm going to say export default list. And now I'm going to write some HTML code to basically embody what our list represents. I am actually going to take this code right here. I'm going to copy paste it inside of here because I want, this is part of my list. I want the heading of my list to be part of my list. All right. So now we created our basic, or I'm going to encapsulate this in a div actually, just so that I can write more HTML code later. So I'm going to say return div, and I'm going to put this code inside of here. Okay. If you go back, you'll notice that you don't see this heading. And we don't see this heading because we haven't actually used the list component within our app.js component. And our app.js component is our overarching component that we use to put all of our sub-created components with it. So in order to actually use the list.component, first we have to import it so that app.js can actually access it. Right. If we don't import it, then app.js doesn't know about this list.js file because it's a separate file. So we're going to import the name of our component, list, from the place where list.js is located. Components is in the same directory as app.js. So we're only going to use one dot and one slash. It's under the components folder. And within the components folder, it's a file called list or list.js, but I think list suffices. And now, in order to actually use our list component, we're going to treat our list component as its own HTML tag. And we're just going to say list closing. So this is our list tag. It is it's a tag that doesn't need both an opening and a close. It just needs itself. It's not like div where you need an opening tag and a closing tag. It just needs this. And now if we save everything and we go back, we'll notice that we have our to-do list back. And this to-do list is part of the list component that we just put into our overarching app component, which is rendered in index.js. Does this make sense? All right. So what is our list actually going to look like? Now we're going to basically edit our list to make it include some important features. So an important feature in our to-do list is we want to be able to input some sort of task, right? For example, our homework. We want to input homework. And then afterwards, we want to click a button. And once we click that button, it inserts that task into our to-do list. So how do we do that? Well, first, we're going to need some input, right? We're going to need some input. So I'm going to create a new div within our list.js. And this div is just a container. And inside it, I'm going to put all of my input stuff. All right. So I'm just going to call this div. I'm going to give it, or I don't even need to call it, but if you want to just be more specific with like the CSS that comes later, you can give it a class name. And this basically just describes what this div is. So I'm just going to call it inputs. And this div is just going to contain all of my inputs. All right. Now, I want to talk about something that's really important in coding in general, and that's documentation. Understanding how to get the correct syntax if you don't know what the correct syntax is. Many of you down the line will maybe not remember how to import a text box or import a button or any other like kind of obscure thing. So to do that, make Google your best friend. If you don't know how to insert a text box, just search it up. HTML text box. And likely you'll see in like, for example, W3 schools, they'll give you a pretty good idea of how to do a text box. And specifically, that's this line of code here. All we need to do is basically use the input tag. And within the input tag, we'll have text. And this is our text box. So I'm actually just going to copy this over, and I'm going to paste it inside of here. Oh, and then I need to close it. And similar to the component tag, input is its own thing. It doesn't need an opening and a closing tag. It's just these input, type text. Make sure you spell text this way. Don't spell like txt or capital T-E-X-T, lowercase t-e-x-t. And then closing tag. Now, if I save and I go back, you'll see I have a text box. In this text box, I can type stuff in it. Awesome. Now I need a button. And this button, basically when I click this button, anything that I type in this text box will be rendered onto the screen. So similarly, if I don't remember how to use a button, I can always search up its documentation. I go here and I notice that, oh, it's really convenient. I have an input type equals button. Input type equals button. And if I save and go back, I'll notice that there's a button next to my text box. Now this button's a little bit weird because it doesn't actually say anything, right? We want our button to say something. We want our button to say maybe like click me or add or something like that. Right? So how do we do that? Well, let's, for the sake of documentation, search up how to do that. The button, HTML give button a value. We'll see that the syntax is really simple. It's just value equals quote value. And whatever inside of this quote is what is going to be displayed on our button. So this is another attribute of this input tag. We're just going to say value equals add. Let's say we want our button to say the word add. If we save and we go back, now we see that our button has add on it. Awesome. So now we included most of the inputs for our web application. Now we want to include some tasks, right? Now we're going to have a lot of tasks, right? We can have like 10 tasks. And just inserting all the tasks like this, let's say we have a task like a paragraph, and the paragraph is going to say our task, right? Like task 1, paragraph for, just copy paste. You did not have this you don't know, yeah, you don't need to write this down by the way. Like task, we can have like, let's say we have 3 tasks for now, right? Task 1, task 2, task 3. and we save this, we'll go back and we see it's displayed here. Now, for 3 tasks, this may be fine. But let's say you're really busy. Let's say you have 100 tasks to do, right? Then we'd have to like copy paste the tasks like 100 times, 50 to 100 times, or some really, really big number, right? That's not very efficient, right? We learned about in CS, I'm sure a lot of you guys have learned about loops. And loops basically allow you to do redundant tasks really simply. Like you just need maybe 1 or 2 lines, paste something, and then it'll paste it like 100 times, right? So we're gonna, at the end of the day, we're gonna want to use some sort of loop. And this loop will help display all of our tasks in a really elegant way. And then our loop, if we think about it, our loop is gonna iterate over some sort of array. It's gonna iterate over some sort of list, right? And for every element inside of that list, we want to display that element onto our screen. So we're actually going to create a list for ourselves. And this list is basically just going to contain all of our task data. So let's create our list. We're going to create the list within the function. And remember last time we talked about in JavaScript, in order to create variables, you can use the keyword let. Or var, they're like really similar, or if you don't want to change it, const. But let's just use let. And we're going to call our list task list. And task list is going to be equal to a list. And within this list, we're going to want to contain, we're going to want to store each one of our tasks. We're going to want to store the data for each one of our tasks, right? Now I'm going to introduce a pretty important concept in JavaScript called an object. And objects are used in many, many different languages. But basically what they are is they store data. Fundamentally, they store data. They store multiple types of data within an object. So to write an object, all we need to do is use the curly braces. And within the curly braces, we're going to define the parameters for our object. So in this case, we're going to want to give our task a title. We're going to want to give a name. So let's just say we want to create the title variable, title, and we're going to give it the name task1. Okay. So this is going to create an object. And within that object, it stores the parameter title. And we gave the title the value of task1. We can store a lot of different types of data within an object. We can store strings, booleans, numbers, anything you name, right? But for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to store the title as a string. And this is going to basically represent each one of our tasks. Each one of our tasks is going to have a title. You can call it whatever. You can call this task anything you want. Yeah. Yeah. If you want to add multiple objects to your task array, you can separate your objects with a comma and create your new task. And let's say our title here is just task2. Right? This is a much more elegant way to write your code, because all of our tasks are basically going to be stored in an array, and we're going to iterate through that array. It's a lot better than just writing out paragraph task1, paragraph task2, paragraph task3, all the way down to as many paragraphs you want. Store all in an array, iterate through the array. It's a much better coding practice. If we really wanted to make our code really, really clean, we could even like export, we can put this task list in a separate file and then like import the task list here and then use it later. And like we can import it here. And then we can like run our for loop on it. But for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to include this task list in our function here. All right, now we're going to actually want to do, now we're actually going to want to display all the items here. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how to use loops in JavaScript. And there's a really, really elegant way to use loops. Namely, we're going to use loops using the function called map. And map is a really useful function in JavaScript. Basically what map does is it takes every element from an array or a list and it transforms it somehow, right? And then it displays it. It makes it, it can store it into a new array. So basically, for instance, if we called map on task list, we would take every element in task list, do something with it, do some sort of transformation to it, and then store it somewhere else, right, or display it. So I'm going to use the map function here in order to basically take all these elements and create a paragraph out of it, create a p tag out of it, right? So I'm going to use that with the map function. So I can call it task list.map. Now this is bad practice. It doesn't work. The reason it doesn't work is because we're currently working in HTML code, but map is JavaScript, right? So we're trying to inject JavaScript within HTML. React lets us inject HTML within JavaScript, but now we're trying to inject JavaScript within HTML. And we can't just do that just like this. What we have to do is we have to surround this with curly braces. And surrounding JavaScript in curly braces allows us to use it within our HTML code. Okay, so now you'll see that VS Code gave it some nice colors. So basically this now is valid code. All right. Map is going to accept a function. All right. And this function is basically going to transform every one of the elements within our list into something else. And this function accepts one parameter, that parameter being each element in our list. So let's create that function. Let's just say this function is called create list element. Okay, yeah, you can create it within the function. That's cool too. List element. And it's going to accept one parameter, that being the data itself, the data, each one of these objects within our list. And now we want it to return basically a paragraph that represents the title. All right, so we can say return. Data is the object itself. If we want to actually access the data, we have to say data dot the parameter title. And that allows us to access task one. We're going to inject that within a paragraph. And remember now that because we're injecting some JavaScript code within our HTML, we have to use the curly braces. And we will say data dot title. And now we can pass this function into task list.map. And if we save, we see that we have our two tasks displayed.
Really good, really useful.
Yeah. It's important that you don't give two parentheses here. And the reason is because if you do the two parentheses, it's actually going to pass in a function call. It's going to pass in the value that is returned by this function, which is not a function. So this code is not correct. Instead, we don't want the parentheses. We just want the name of the function. And by passing in the name of the function, we pass in the function itself instead of the value returned by the function call. Now, I'm going to give everyone a little bit of time just to catch up. But afterwards, I'm going to explain a slightly cleaner way to write this code.
Are we all there?
Right. Now notice that this create list element function here, it's really only used once, and it only serves one purpose, and that is to map, right? So by creating a whole function, it's a little bit inefficient, right? We can do a little better here. And we're going to use a really important JavaScript tool in one of the newest versions of JavaScript called ES6. And that tool, I believe it's called like inline functions or like lambda functions. Yeah, arrow functions, And basically what that allows us to do, it allows us to create a function without specifying its name all within one line. So we don't need to specify the name create list element. We can just write out the function in here, right? So here's how the syntax works. First, we want to specify the name of the parameters, right? So remember how originally we're passing in one parameter, that being data, right? So we're going to say data, and then we're going to write an arrow sign using equals followed by this greater than sign. And make sure that your arrow is equals, not dash. Equals called the fat arrow, yeah. And then we're going to write out everything that's here. This is basically the body of our function now. All right. And the body of our function is basically just going to be the paragraph. So basically just this stuff. And if we save, JavaScript is going to make it look, it's going to linter it, so it's going to make it look pretty nice.
Yeah, so you can think about this like doing like 1 + 1, right? You don't need to create 2 different variables. Call them 1 + 1. Like these are numbers you're only using once, you're never using yet. So you don't just store it in the variable there and make it nameless. So that's what a lambda function is. It's a nameless function that you're using once, you're never using it yet.
Yep. Notice how we never specify a name for this function. It's just in line. We specify what it needs, and we specify what it returns, all without specifying the actual name of the function. So we're never going to use this function outside of this map, right? So now if we go back, we'll notice nothing changed, right? Our 2 tasks are displayed as they should be. And in fact, we can just take this out. And we save, nothing changed. Okay, sick. Our website right now, it displays a list, right? It's not the best looking list, but it's a list. The only problem is that it doesn't actually do anything when we want to type something in and click add, right? Nothing happens. Our website is static, right? Nothing changes. So in order for our website to change, we're going to introduce a concept that Keshvi talked about earlier called state. So what is state? Well, state is just the condition of our web app. And whenever we change the condition of our web app, our state responds as well. And then our web page reacts to the change of state. And that's actually why this framework is called React, because it reacts anytime we change the state. All right. So we're going to have a couple of states that we need to define here. First, one of the states that we need to define is the thing that we put inside of our text box itself, right? That holds a state, right? Because whenever we type something like task 3, we want our web page to know that this is the task that we want to input, right? And whenever we change that, we want the state to change, right? Because now we're going to insert something different, right? So this is a state. And let's actually create the state right now. Okay. We're going to create the state, and that state is going to be anything that is typed within our text box, right? So that when we add, we can render this change state, this title state, to our tasks. Now, in order to use state in React, we're going to introduce a really, really important concept called hooks. And to use hooks, you basically go to import React, and right after the React, you type comma, curly braces, and then type use state, exactly how I typed here.
So you can actually import, like you can just say react.useState, but just for simplicity's sake, JavaScript's really cool where it'll let you kind of import parts of the object React and only import those parts. So here we're importing react.useState.
Yep. Okay. Now that we imported useState, let's actually use useState. So let's go back in our function of list, and we're going to give our title, the thing that we insert into our list or our text box, a state. So useState itself is a function. The useState function accepts one parameter, and that parameter is the default value of the state. That means that the state or the value of the state once we refresh our web page. So in this case, we want our default value just to be empty string, because when we reload our web page, we want, we haven't entered anything yet, right? So the thing that we entered in here, that's the state of that, is just empty. It's just an empty string. useState returns an array, and this array has two elements in it. The first element of the array is the variable of the state itself. And the second element of this array is a function that is used to change this variable, change the state variable. So we can say, for example, let's just say let r equals useState. And r is going to hold those two values. So now whenever we want to reference the state, we can just say r of 0. And whenever we want to reference the function, we can say r of 1. But this is a little bit confusing, right? We want to give these values names. We want to say that r0 is the state. We want to give that a variable name, and we want r1 to be the function, and we want to give that function a name so that whenever we use that function, we can just use the name instead of r1, which is a little bit confusing. JavaScript allows us to do this in a very elegant way. And this elegant way is called destructuring an array. And what that means is basically, instead of saying r, we can just say the array itself, and we can pass in the two values that are involved in this array. That being the state and the change state function. So I'm just going to call the state title, and I'm going to call the function set title. And now whenever we want to reference the state of the title itself, we can just use the title variable. And whenever we want to change title, we can just use the set title function. All right. Now we want to set the value of whatever we type into this box type into the text box as value. And that allows our state to change as we input something into our text box. Right? And then afterwards, we're going to display that title state into this part here, into the list. Okay. So in order to set the value of whatever is in the text box to title, we're going to do something really similar to this button. We're going to say value equals the name of the state title. If I save this and I go back and refresh and try to type something, you'll notice that nothing is happening. I'm slamming away this keyboard. Nothing is appearing on here. And that's because we actually aren't able to, title itself isn't able to adapt. Title itself is not able to adapt. The default value of this text box is given to title, which right now is empty string. And it's always going to be empty string. But we want title to adapt to any changes in our text box. So in order to do that, we have to use another parameter here called onChange. And onChange is going to let us set title to whatever is in, to whatever that we insert. So we're going to say onChange equals, and onChange is actually going to accept a function. Okay. OnChange is going to accept a function. And because it's a JavaScript function, we need to encapsulate it within these curly braces. All right. Now, the thing that is actually triggered by this function is something called, or sorry, the thing that we pass into this function on change is something called an event. And in order to explain what an event is, I'm just actually going to log that event so that we all can kind of understand what it is. So the parameter is called event, and I'm going to log it. All right. So again, I use this inline function here that we use here. But basically, this function accepts a parameter called event, and then it logs the event. So if we go back, I'm going to right click, inspect element. And then I'm going to go to console. Now, anytime I type something, it's not working. Oh, I forgot to save it. Every time I type something, you'll see that we logged our event. Now, our event is really, really complicated. There's a lot of parameters with this event. Right? The specific parameter that we're going to want to tap into is target value. And target value is basically the parameter of this event that specifies whatever was typed in here. Right? So now we're going to want to set title to event.target.value. And that's going to allow us to set title to whatever, the title state to whatever was typed inside of that text box. So I'm going to say event. And now for every event, we're going to want to set event, or set title, sorry. Set title to event.target.value. Yeah. And now if we save and we go back, we can see that we can type stuff because our title is actually changing. Now, finally, we want, or for what I'm going to teach today, we're going to want to give our button some state as well. Or we're going to want to give our list some state so that whenever we type this in and add, it can appear here, right? So we're going to want to create another state, and that state is basically, that state is going to represent the state of our to-do list in total. So, or let's say, to do, set to do equals use state. And I'm going to give this the default value of, let's say, the task list. All right. And now, whenever we click the button, we want to add the value of title into our list. So similar to onChange, we're going to use another attribute in button called onClick. And onClick is going to accept a parameter, also a function. Here we're going to actually create our function. We're going to call it onSubmit. And onSubmit is going to be a function that's going to let us do some things. That's going to basically let us update the to-do state to include title. So I'm going to create a function here. OnSubmit. And OnSubmit is going to basically set to do to be something else. It's going to want to set to do. And it's going to set to do to be whatever to do was previously and our new, it's going to create a new class. Oops. So this line indentation, basically what it does is it's going to create a new list. The first n-1 elements of that list are going to be what was previously given to us. And remember, the default value is just task list, which is just this. And it's going to inject a new object into our list. And finally, if we want to actually render this new stated list, we're just going to say to-do.map data. Something happened. Wait 1 second. Something happened.
Just change the order of tasks.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you used it before you declared it.
Yeah. Sorry. Put this. Yeah. Let's see. Put this here. Okay. Now, if I save and I ask, 3. And now if I add task 3, we see that task 3 appears. If I add task 4 appears right underneath. So basically just to recap everything that we talked about so far. We created a list component. This list component returns some HTML, namely here. The HTML contains a few inputs given by the text box and the button. And then we map our function, we map our list, our array that contains some items here, and we create paragraphs out of all those items. Then we introduce state using the useState hook. And state allows our web app to respond, to react whenever there's a change of state. Namely, when we change the title, when we change what we actually insert into our text box, and that is the title state. And then our to-do state allowed us to update this task list with our new inserted item. And then we use to-do.map in order to map out everything, in order to display everything that was within our to-do array as a new paragraph tag. So that anytime that we insert something into our list and click the submit button and to click the add button, our web page reacts to it. Right. Now, Kevin is going to take over and he's going to explain some cool quirks that you can use for this to-do list.
Yeah, cool. So one thing that you might notice, first of all, is that whenever I change this and I submit, it's not disappearing over here. That may sound like some difficult problem. It's really easy. All you need to do is that whenever you submit, you got to reset the title. You got to reset the title to an empty string. So simply just write set title and then an empty string. And now when you submit, when you call that function, we're resetting the title to an empty string. So if I click add, you'll see it's gone. Good stuff. All right, cool. So now let's talk a bit about our to-do list, right? What's a specific feature that every to-do list needs? We need to basically check it off, right, when we're done. And the way to do that is to create some sort of like checkbox. And then when we can check it off, and then it'll disappear from our array. So before we actually make the checkbox, I want to talk a little bit about props and components. So as we remember from before, right, a component can have many different subcomponents. So our list here can have a bunch of items. And here we can have a bunch of really complicated logic for each item. And what if we essentially want to take that logic and put it in another file? So what we're going to do now is we're going to map a bunch of item components as opposed to just this actual raw paragraph component. So I want you all to right click on your components and create a new file and just call it item.js. And this is just going to be the place where we have our new item. And we're just going to do the same thing as we did before. We're going to import React. All right. And then we're going to create our function. So actually a cool thing you can do, I actually don't know if this will work, I hope it works, is you can just say export default and then function and then the name of your function. And then this inherently exports this item as a default instead of having to put it at the bottom. So now all we have to do is we have to go over to our list and copy that paragraph tag and then return it in our item. Give you all a second. And you'll notice really quickly that data here is not defined, right? Because we've entered a new file and data is not defined here. So essentially, the question that comes is how do we actually pass down data to our item? And that's kind of where props come in. So first, I'm going to import our item just like we did before with the list. So I'm going to say import item from ./item, right? Because this is the file that we're importing from. And it's in the same directory as our list. All right. And now we're just going to take this paragraph tag and we're going to remove it. And we're just going to say item and then close it. Right. And then you'll see, right, for our input, right, we can have a type that's equal to button. We can have a value that's add, and we can have an on click. Well, you can actually do those same things with JavaScript or with React. So here we're going to pass in the prop, right? And it's going to be our data. So we can call it like, let's just call it item data, for instance, right? And we can set it equal to our data. And here, remember that this is JavaScript, so we actually have to open curly and close curly. So now we have this item data attribute that we can actually access, right? So our function, our item here, can actually pass in one parameter, which is props. Or, as we mentioned before, we can destructure it. So we can have our object, and then we can pass in the parameter data. Sorry, item data, right? Yeah. Item data is going to be the name. So item data. All right. So this is a prop that we're passing in, right? We're essentially, in a way, inheriting it from our parent, which is our list. And you can see why this is considered a component tree. So now, instead of data.title, we're going to say item data.title. And now, if I save everything, by the way, you can do Command Option S on Mac. I don't know what it is on Windows. Does anyone know? Command Alt S maybe to save all your files. You can do Command Option S on Mac to save all your files. I'm sure a quick Google search will help you figure that out for whatever you're using. But this will save all your files, so you don't need to go and hand save every single file because we are going to be dealing with a lot of files now, right? So now if I go here, everything works the same. Cool. So now let's create a checkbox. So within our item, right, we're going to create a checkbox. But remember that we have to have a div to enclose everything because we're going to have two components now as opposed to one. So let's create a div. And let's put our paragraph tag into the div. And now let's add a new input items or a new tag. And it's going to be an input. And the type of it is going to be checkbox. Yeah, there you go. So now if I save this and I go over here, you'll see that we now have a checkbox. Give you all a second. Oh yeah, sure. All right, and now I'm just going to do a little CSS just to kind of make things a little prettier than this. Obviously, our logic is here, right? Our structure is here, but it's not very pretty. And we can add a little bit of CSS, some styling, in order to make it prettier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide this div, our item, a class. So I'm going to say class name, because class means something else in JavaScript. So in React, we say class name instead of class. Equals, and then a string. We'll call it item, for instance, right? And then within our CSS, we're actually going to want to create a new class called item, and we might want to add some styling to it. So I'm actually going to go to app.css. We actually don't need all this, so you can just remove it, but it's not gonna affect your code if you don't use it. Because that was like our default styling that we used before in that little spinny like React thing that was the default for our create React app. But here I'm gonna create a new CSS class called .item. And then I'm just gonna give it a background color, background hyphen color of aquamarine, sure. So we have this class name that's item, and now in our CSS, we're actually using that item. And a reminder that we actually have to import CSS files, and lucky for us, React already did that for us. So it's already imported here, and it's included into all our files, so our styles are actually imported. So if I save all this, save all these files, and go over here, we have a little bit more styling, which is nice. How are we doing? Good. You can do whatever color you want, or style it however you want. Like I can add like a border, like you don't need to follow me here. That's like 2 pixels and like solid. Then I could like give it a border radius of like 20 pixels just to make it, you know, a little better, I guess. Give it a little padding. You don't need to follow me here, but just adding a little style, just to make things a little nicer. There you go. Sure, good enough. All right. Yeah, this is not stuff you have to do. This is just some styling. Definitely recommend styling this in your own time. We're just providing you the logic, and then you can go in your own time and make this a lot better looking than what we have here. Yeah, sure. So we're importing this item fragment, and then we're saying item data equals our data. And then over in our item, we're actually including it in this object. And then we're just getting item data.title. All right. Cool. So now when I hit this checkbox, right, I want things to disappear. I want the item that I check to disappear. And right now, if I hit this check button, right, nothing happens because we actually have to code this feature ourselves, unfortunately. So we need a function, right? And this function will actually update our array. Okay, so let's create this function and call it like function remove item. And this function will take the one parameter and it'll be like the data, right? So we're going to pass in the data when we remove the parameter. All right. So now I actually want to call this function whenever I hit the checkbox. So in order to do that, right, because our checkbox is in our item, we actually have to include it. And the cool thing about props, right, is that, and the cool thing about JavaScript, right, is that functions are objects too. So what we can do is we can say remove item equals remove item, and we can just pass it in, just like we did with our data object. And then, once again, we can call it up here. So we can call remove item. And then we can use the event on change. And then whenever we change whatever happens in the checkbox, we can call this function remove item. So I'm going to say on change, remove item. Give you all a second. So this is whenever the checkbox changes, we have this event that fires and it calls that function. And just to show and just to pray and hope that everything's working, I'm just going to console log, check just to make sure things are working. Whenever you want to work in JavaScript and React, you always want to do little things at a time. You want to make sure that everything works little bits at a time so that you kind of don't create a bunch of code and then try to run it. It doesn't work out. You have a ton to debug. So I strongly recommend doing things step by step. Yeah. Does anyone need more time? I'm just kind of chugging through this because we're a little short on time here. All right, so now if I click this checkbox, you'll see that this event is being called and it says checked. So everything is good. All right. So now I think that what we want to do is we want to actually pass in some of our data, right? So remember before we did event.target.value, and this would get the input of our text, right? But the problem here, right, is that we don't really care about what happens with our checkbox. We want the actual data of the item, and we want to use that to compare to our list in order to update our list and remove it. So our checkbox, the event.target.value, if I'm not mistaken, is just going to say checked and unchecked. And we don't really want that, right? We actually want the data so we can find that data within our array and remove it. So here we want to pass in the parameter, item data, so that we can actually use it in our remove item function. But also take a moment to see kind of what we've done here. We're calling this function remove item when on change, this attribute here expects a function. So like for instance, if this function were to return 2, right? Remove item data would be a 2. It would be a function call that would return a value as opposed to a function. And here we only want to pass in a function. So essentially the question becomes, how do I pass in the parameter without actually calling a function? And the way to do that is to actually take this and as contradictory as it may seem, turn it into a function. Because this here is just going to simply be a 2. It's going to simply return this 2 value. So what we do is we actually just create a nameless function. And now we're actually not calling this function, right? We're creating some sort of parent function for this little function to be called whenever this event is triggered. So now this entire thing is a function and it's not going to be called. It's not a value of 2, does that make sense? Okay, good. So I'm just going to remove this 2, right? So let me obviously make sure that everything's working. You don't need to do this, but I'm just going to say console log data, come over here, check it out, click here, and you'll see that we have this huge. Wait, let me just refresh. Why is this an event? Oh, because I didn't save this. There you go. Okay. Yeah, make sure that you're saving everything. And then there you go. Now it works. Cool. So now essentially what I want to do is I actually want to go through my array and I want to find the element that has the same information as our as the element that we're actually calling here, and I want to remove it from our array. So in order to do that, I actually need to use something called the filter method. So here we have map, you know, there are other things. There's like for each, there's sum, there's also this thing called filter. So what I can do is I can say to do dot filter, and filter takes in a function once again. And this function is basically a function that says, if this Boolean that this function returns is true, we keep that item. If not, we remove that item. If you ever use sort in Python and it passes in a function, it's very, very similar to that. So like, for example, if I create a function that always returns true, right? Nothing of our array is going to change. But here, I actually want to return a condition. And if that condition is false, then I want to filter it out of the array. And that condition, right, is going to be whether that data's title is the same as the title that we want to remove. So let's say, let's pass in the parameter item, right? Because our filter is going to go through it. It's going to be like a for loop, right? It's going to go through our to-do list, and it's going to pass in this this parameter every single time. And that will represent the data at each part of the to-do list, which is right here. So now I want to check if item data or item dot title, so the title of whatever item we're at, is actually equal to the data dot title. And then JavaScript, actually, we use 3 equal signs. Because some things are objects, things get confusing. And 3 equal signs means that not only does this have to be the same thing, it has to be the same type, because sometimes types can get confusing and sometimes this will work, but we want to be safe and make sure that 3 equal signs does not work, or 3 equal signs works. So if I save this, sorry. Actually, you know what? Let me just show you what happens. So if I save, nothing happens. Yeah, sorry, that's because nothing should happen, right? Because to do is going to filter through here, right? And we actually want, and what this function does is it returns an array. So let's actually grab that array and save it somewhere. So let's say like const, because we're never going to change it. Const result equals to do dot filter, right? And if I print out this result, just to show you guys, you don't need to do this. If I print this out for you and I click this, it creates this huge object that filters through our array. So if I add more, like ISD homework or something, and I click this, you'll see that actually I did not do this correctly, right? Because you remember that our filter function should will only keep things in which this Boolean here is true. So it actually has to be not equals. So we want to keep everything in which the data's title is not the same as our item's title. So I feel like that's a little confusing. That's my bad. That was a typo on my part, but let me show you. So if I were to go here now, and I were to say ISD homework and add it, if I click on the ISD homework, you'll see our array now contains everything that isn't ISD homework. Right? So the last thing I have to do, right, is I have to actually update our state to contain our new array as opposed to our old to do. So now all I have to do is set to do to result. So now we're updating to do to our new result. And I don't need this line. So actually a weird quirk about this, right, is that if you have multiple titles that are the same, this is not going to work. It's going to remove all the titles that are the same, right? This is simply for demonstration purposes for now, but what you want to do in the future is you want to have some sort of unique identifier for each of these, whether that be, the date that's created, some sort of unique ID, something like that. So like, for instance, if I create something else called task one, right, and I click this, it's going to remove all the task ones, and it's not going to be great. And the other thing you'll notice that's kind of weird is that this thing is checked, right? This should not be checked. This creates some really, really weird behavior. So like if I were to check this, right, this becomes checked, which is really odd. And the reason why is because React uses these things called keys, and it uses these keys as sort of unique identifiers to know which component to update. So you'll see here that we have an error, right? Each child in the list should have a unique key prompt. And the problem is actually in this map function, right? We're creating this array of elements, and then we're updating these elements, but we're also kind of keeping the same keys because we're not specifically declaring them. So actually what I want to do is I want to give this item a key value. And these keys are core to, or they're default for all HTML elements whenever you use a map. So actually, this is not something that we're passing in as a prop. This is an actual attribute of our div. All right, and this key can be anything, right? It can be a number, it can be a string. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this data object and I'm going to turn it into a string. So you'll recall that, right? Our data is just going to be this JavaScript object, but an object is not a valid key. So I'm just going to say JSON, which is JavaScript object notation. This is what that's what this object is, right? It's a JavaScript object that's written in JavaScript object notation. And I'm going to stringify it. So stringify is a function that takes an object and turns it into a string. And I'm going to stringify this data. So now our key is truly going to be a unique value that React can use to update only that component. Any questions? Yeah, so that is where I'm going to leave it for now. Knowing that I know a lot of you have assessments, I might stick around and add a feature where you can add, a calendar to your to-do list. So if you want to stick around for that, that's fine. But I also understand that everyone has a lot of work to do. So I'm just going to close really quickly. Safari. Let's go to slideshow. Here are some resources that you can definitely use. Like when I first learned React, when Richard first learned React, we both use Udemy, which is really, really cool. A lot of really cheap courses there. Strongly recommend. But here are some other really cool resources. We're going to put them all in our VH mentorship GitHub. And then we also have a couple of take homes for you. For example, there's this cool little take home called Magic State Ball, where you can kind of create your own little 8-ball using state. So definitely a cool little project that you can try out. And then the other one is actually making our to-do list a little more advanced by adding things like priority, by adding date, which we unfortunately did not have time to get to today. But if you want to stick around, I will implement that. Yeah, and the other thing is that we have vhl.inc/feedback. So if you want to give us feedback, we definitely would love it. Obviously, these workshops are for you guys. So we definitely want to hear what you guys have to say about them, about what we can improve in our next workshops. And you also get a chance at some cool VH swag. So yeah, someone who submitted feedback won a VH tumbler last time. And we're going to give out some more swag. So more opportunities for that. And yeah, that's about it. Thank you guys.